As we begin this program, I wanted to pose the question, are we a republic or a democracy?
Nobody really knows anymore. We began as a republic.
And how is that defined?
A republic is a constitutionally based society in which the government derives from the people and works by the principle of representation, and that government is constrained by a set of boundaries that the people have created through their constitutional process, and the people are vigilant in protecting their system from growing beyond the boundaries that they all agreed upon. So a republic has a social compact, a written constitution, limited government, and government by representation of the people.
And what is a democracy?
A democracy is where everybody, every citizen gathers into one big auditorium and they hammer out every question. And there has never really been a democracy in world history, but the one we all think of is Athens, where everybody was in, so that they would call these giant town meetings, and the people of Athens, the citizens, white men, would gather together in the agora, and they would talk about every question. And even some of their courts were gigantic. The court that sat in judgment of Socrates before he was condemned to death was a huge court, larger than any court ever seen in the Western Hemisphere since.
What would the Founding Fathers wish for us today?
Well, the Founding Fathers did not like the idea of democracy because they believed that the people are sovereign. All authority comes from the people, but they frankly felt that the people weren't really up to it. And so you have to pay respect to the people, and they grant the authority for a government to exist on their behalf. But the Founding Fathers thought we need to create some distancing mechanisms between the actual people and the government that does things for them. So the problem with democracy, they thought, was, first of all, the people aren't well enough informed to make good decisions about matters of great importance. And secondly, because there are only a few rich and there are masses of less wealthy people, the fear was that the mass would redistribute wealth downward to themselves and thus destroy the basic prosperity of the community.
So more of a communist theory, perhaps?
Well, it could be. I mean, it could move towards that.
Perhaps.
I mean, Jefferson, for example, my expertise basically lies in Jefferson amongst the Founding Fathers. Jefferson was a kind of a socialist. He thought that all men are born equal and that in the ideal society they would stay equal. And that government certainly shouldn't be siding with the few. It should side with everybody, but if it had to choose, it should side with the many and not the few. And that government should either create a neutral set of rules under which everybody can thrive, or it should try everything it can this side of tyranny to keep things equal as long as possible. John Adams and others said to Jefferson, "You're crazy. You can reshuffle the cards as much as you want, but within a couple of years, the rich will always be rich and the poor will always be poor, and there's nothing really to be done about this. Social inequality is a fact of social life, and that it's as old as time. And so that you can't engineer a utopian society. You can create conditions under which things can be much better than otherwise, but you cannot engineer a communist, an equalitarian society." So that's a paradox. All men are created equal. They don't stay equal very long. In a democracy, they would all be right there voting. But in a democracy, it's impossible today, 300 million people. The New England town meeting is sort of the last vestige of democracy in America, and even then, in a New England town meeting, and they do thrive still, it's self-selecting. It's like the people who go to the school board meeting or the city council meeting. It's the people who already are civically engaged turn up at those things, but in every community there's a mass of people who are home watching television or disengaged from public life.
It's been interesting over the last few years. We've seen a great deal of excitement of politics within broadcasting and the public participation because of that. Would the Founding Fathers have thought more information, the better off you are, or would they have been concerned about the way the information is being portrayed?
Well, they would have to be concerned about the way the information is being brokered between where it arises and the public. I don't think that any rational being looking at our system is very respectful of the way in which the media brokers the gap between power and the people. Media has to attract, and especially in a world of commercial television like ours. And in order to attract, it has to be attractive. And some ideas are not attractive. Tariffs and nuclear non-proliferation and the Kyoto Accords and federal court issues about jurisprudence are too complex, too abstract, frankly, too boring for the mass of people. And so if the media is going to play this sort of a role, it either has to jazz it up sufficiently to make it watchable, or it needs to ignore a great deal. Well, the good news is that we have newspapers, which can be a little more, theoretically, a little more serious and detailed than television. We also have public media. We have public television, public radio, and we have the internet. And the internet is sort of the democratic breakthrough. It is now, in the early 21st century, possible for an average citizen to know more than he or she ever did in the whole history of the United States. An average citizen can follow legislation, can look up all the laws, can examine the history of the Senate or the House. An average citizen is in a position to know just an enormous amount about the workings of government. Whether an average citizen has time or interest to do all of that is another question, but the problem of access has largely been overcome by the explosion of the electronic media.
From a constitutional point of view, one would think that the amount of information available online would be beneficial to follow the Constitution.
But you have to understand the rules of engagement. In other words, let me give you an analogy. It's possible to find a virtually infinite amount of sports statistic on the internet, or even in a newspaper. It's always amazing. You open up the sports section of a newspaper, and there are 2 or 3 pages of nothing but tabulations, just raw statistics. If you don't know anything about baseball, those statistics are meaningless. You have to know something about the sport before those data points become useful to you. If Americans don't know what's at stake, how laws are passed, the role of the judiciary, the evolution of our democratic culture, the nature of power in a world that's partly global and partly particular, then those statistics, however lavish they are, aren't going to be useful. And I think one of the things that's most missing in our culture is basic civics education. You know, when I was growing up back in the 1960s, civics was still a central part of our educational curriculum. It is not any longer.
And how do you define civics?
Civics is an awareness of the basic documents of your culture, the software of your culture, the social compact, to know that there are 3 branches of government, that within the legislative branch is a House and a Senate, that the terms are staggered. Here's how a law is passed, here's how a law is vetoed, this is what the impeachment clause means, here's the Bill of Rights, when it was passed, what it means, how it's been interpreted. You know, civics is an understanding of the formal legal mechanism by which a civilization resolves differences, shares power, and shares resources. And frankly, most people in the early 21st century have a very slender understanding of how power is actually worked in the public arena. We need that. Jefferson was, of course, the founding father who believed in this most strenuously. He said, "Enlighten the people generally, and every form of tyranny will disappear like fog when the sun rises in the morning." But Jefferson also said, if you expect to be a nation ignorant and free, you expect what never has been and never can be. I'm not a pessimist, Sam, but I think in some sense, in an age when on television there is celebrity gossip, golf and basketball, tractor pull, wrestling shows, dating shows, reality television, sitcoms, dramas, cop shows, and so on, the average citizen has so many attractive distractions that there is very little focus on the kind of slightly dull world of civics. In a sense, it doesn't matter except that everything is at stake. If we don't watch our government, history shows us that our government will slip away from us. And that was the message of the fathers.
Well, an interesting counter to that would be that through the internet, that far more people are able to read newspapers than
Yes.
ever read print editions, even though that is not good for the newspaper business in terms of that hard copy that has now become a historical document of what occurred in the last 24 hours. But if someone is willing to take the time, they can set themselves up with news alerts and follow whatever's happening in the news, including the world of politics, in far greater detail and with far easier access than they ever could before.
Absolutely. I mean, we're living in the best of times if we choose to engage ourselves. The question is, how do you take an 18-year-old, or for that matter, an 80-year-old, and provide cultural incentives for them to actually sit there in front of that terminal and to look up data about, let's say, the Farm Bill, or global warming, or America's foreign aid. You know, you have to have the desire to be a citizen. I mean, it sounds crazy, but most Americans in the 21st century are consumers, and they are they're part of the national identity of the United States. They have jobs, they have recreations, but the thing that you would not automatically say of most people is that they're citizens. If by citizen we mean actively engaged in following and helping to shape their own self-government.
But it's interesting too, though, that they would have the ability to do that in the same way that most people, I think, become involved with the Constitution, politics in general, is how does it affect me? When you hit that little bump in the road that says, you know, I have a problem, whether in my business or in my private life or whatever, that's connected to something, that's connected to politics, connected to the Constitution, that is the spur for you to gain that interest and start gaining knowledge, and then hopefully one would hope that people will become more actively involved.
I like your enthusiasm, I like your optimism. You're a Jeffersonian. You believe that the people can do it and that they will do it, and that it's really a question of where's the traction between an individual and his or her government. I like that very much. And I'm not attempting at all to be a pessimist, but I am saying that if you look at someone like Jefferson, who was really deeply, deeply committed to a republic, his view was, if the people turn away, government will begin to do mischief. It will spend your money unwisely. It will regulate you in a way that you will later find bites you but didn't know about because you weren't watching. It will engage in foreign adventures. It will listen to the loudest, wealthiest, most powerful members of the community and ignore the quiet members of the community, what Richard Nixon used to call the silent majority. Jefferson's view was that a republic can only work through what he called eternal vigilance. You're talking about voluntary, occasional vigilance when it bites, or when you find a rough edge between you and your state, you and the government. Jefferson would say that's not enough. He wanted a nation of 300 million deeply fascinated, curious, skeptical, a little bit grumpy citizens who were watching everything and saying, why is the school board ordering lunch from Taiwan and not from next door? Why is that airplane contract going to China and not to Boeing? Why are these senators going on these junkets to Scotland? I mean, the Jefferson citizen is grumpy and is watching everything and knows how the system works and says, you are violating the principles. You've taken money out of my pocket and you are now spending it in ways that suit you, but don't pay attention to the fact that the money came from my pocket and you don't have an automatic right to use it in the way that you choose. You know, we're not that republic anymore.
Here's a few questions to think about and discuss. Question 1. Do you think we're still a republic, as outlined by Professor Jenkinson? Question 2. Do you think that we should still try to be a republic, or accept that we are a kind of democratic empire? Question 3. The Founding Fathers disliked the idea of democracy, government by the people themselves. What was their reasoning? Question 4. Jefferson's idea was that government should treat all of its citizens equally, at least in the arena of the law and the distribution of government benefits. Have we achieved this goal? Question 5. Today, an average citizen has access to more information about legislation than ever before, thanks to the media. Is this good? Does it make for better legislation?
We started out this program asking the question, are we a republic or a democracy? We've defined what they are. What are we?
Good question. And I have to say, I don't really know. I think about this all the time. We are clearly a republic in that we have a constitution. Our government operates according to it. A president can veto an act of legislation. The Supreme Court sits in judgment of legislation and declares some of it to be constitutional and some of it not. When two states get into a dispute, they don't go to war with each other. It's settled by the courts and arbitration. We can impeach a president if we wish to, and so on. We have a republic in that the people still have a huge measure of control over their government, and the government basically works by principles of representation. At the same time, we're a democracy. The Founding Fathers intended the country, frankly, to be run by white males of a significant property base. Those doors have blown off. A poor black person can vote or become the mayor of a city. A Hispanic person can vote. Women are Supreme Court justices and senators and maybe presidents of the United States. American Indians were once regarded as foreign nations, the way we might regard Icelanders or South Sea Islanders. Today, they're full citizens of the United States, and yet they enjoy certain Native American sovereignties and privileges. We are democracy in the sense that everybody's in. You know, the late senator from Massachusetts, Paul Tsongas, said, "Everybody's in." That was his mantra, and that's true. Everybody's in this culture. There are no politically disenfranchised groups. That ended in the 1960s. There are, to be sure, economically disenfranchised groups. There are people who are so busy trying to put food on the table and to keep their lights on that they are effectively out of the system. That's a big concern. But it's not a political issue of franchise and legal rights. It's more of a basic prosperity and means issue. So we're a republic in that we have representation. We're a democracy in that the whole population of 300 million is engaged somehow, is canvassed in opinion polls and so on. And even, Sam, you know, those 20 million illegal aliens that we hear about every 4 years, they're in some sense. They don't have full voting rights, but their will is taken into account. Services are provided for them. They have access to our medical care system. They have access to our roads, our bridges, so that there's a gigantic, almost breathtaking expansion of American possibilities between 1787 and the early 21st century. In that sense, we're a democracy. But it's a democracy that we all know is not controlled democratically. In other words, our government, we all know, doesn't represent all 300 million of us equally. It represents the privileged, the powerful, the highly educated, the people with access better than it represents people who live in, say, a trailer in Jordan, Montana, or on an Indian reservation in South Dakota. That's a problem, and there's a lot of talk about, you know, the shadow government or the world of Halliburton and Enron and the power of money in this culture, and it's not just in this culture, it's in global culture. And then finally, we're also an empire. The United States has hundreds of bases all over the world. We have the largest military. Our military spending just staggers the rest of the world. If you add up every other country's military spending, it's less than our military spending. We're the world's unipower. We have client states, including Israel. That wasn't intended by the Founding Fathers. But here's a really interesting little historical analogy. You know, here you hear from time to time of the analogy between the Roman Republic and the Roman Empire and America. And I usually think that that's a pretty shallow analogy, but there's something to it. At the time of Cicero and Julius Caesar, what happened was, this is about the time of Christ, the Roman Republic was breaking down because Rome had extended its empire to Egypt and to the rest of the world. It had armies all over. It had proconsuls. It was bringing in grain from everywhere. It had all these refugee immigrants who had come to Rome. There was a huge welfare state growing. And The old Roman stock of hardy farmers living quietly on the land and serving in the legions and controlling that government disappeared. And they tried to maintain this republic after the republic couldn't hold together any longer. And the strain was civil war, the famous wars between Caesar and Pompey and so on. Finally, the assassination of Julius Caesar. The system broke down because the Republican Constitution of Rome couldn't contain the globalization of Rome's power. When that happens, it leads to constitutional crisis. It leads to resource wars, to corruption in government, to civil war at times, to greater and greater uses of violence. We are sort of in this sort of position in the United States. Whether we like it or not, we have gigantic global responsibilities, and our resource hunger is just overwhelming for oil from the Middle East, bauxite from South America, etc. Whether you can be the unipower in a global environment in which your people are by far and away the most prosperous on earth, using a government created by James Madison in 1787, is a really interesting question. And a lot of people who aren't pessimists, just from a political theory point of view, say we are inevitably making a transition from a republic into a empire because we have no choice. That's the world we actually live in the early 21st century.
Here are some more discussion questions. Question 6. Jefferson believed that a republic requires well-educated, well-informed, engaged citizens. What would he think of the quality of the citizens in our time? Question 7. Does our media do a good job in keeping us informed about important public affairs? Question 8. Does the explosion of the internet make our civic life better or just more confused? Question 9. What kind of civics education should be taught in our public schools?
You've brought up the discussion of the global spread of the United States. But in fact, the reality is that corporations have been global for many years through the internet and communications, satellites. Every country is now part of this global process. We see it with the transportation of oil around the world, of basic needs like steel and concrete, etc. There is no going back. There's no putting the genie back in the jar. We cannot withdraw everybody from around the world and bring them, whether military or private citizens, and operate everything from the United States on our own. We would not exist, and certainly not competitively. So does it have to be a choice between empire, or is there another way for us to be able to continue on into the future and yet still maintain our connection to that Constitution?
Boy, that's a hard question, and I don't know the answer to it because you're talking about a question of such gigantic magnitude. You know, are we still in control? Can we still control our world? Was it inevitable that we would become the unipower? You know, after World War II, it was a dual world, the Soviet Union and its satellites, and the United States and its clients, and in a vast struggle for the future of civilization. And capitalism in the West won, and communism in the East lost. Then we became the world's unipower. Do we have to be? Does there have to be a unipower?
Well, but also you now have China, you have India.
They're rising.
These are, you know, in the near future, these are going to be other powers. We will
That's
not
good
be a
news.
unipower.
That's good news. It's good news not to have a unipower. This is the Founding Fathers wouldn't have liked this, not even Hamilton. They wouldn't have liked that we have this much authority in the world. When you have that authority, even if you don't want to use it, you have to, because if there's a dispute somewhere and it has to get settled to keep the oil lanes open, or to keep the world's commerce moving, or to keep the currencies of the world solvent, somebody has to step in. There has to be a sheriff. And if nobody else is the sheriff and we're the unipower, we wind up doing that sort of thing, whether it suits us or not, and whether we're interested or not. It's expensive, it's degrading, it sort of follows the old biblical phrase, the pitch doth defile. So ideally, there would be a world in which authority and power are shared in something like the United Nations. The European Union is a good example of this. Lots of nations get to be republics now because we're the empire. Canada gets to be a republic because it has the United States next to it. If there were no United States, Canada might have to be quite a different country. Europe gets to be peaceful, and engaged in all this multilateral trade and cooperation because the United States is a kind of umbrella, a security umbrella that stands over that world. Take the US out of that equation, it's different. But as you say, the rise of China is going to have just unbelievable impact on the future of the globe. India, Indonesia, the Japanese-Korean corridor. There is power and wealth and challenge coming to the West from all sorts of directions. And even the countries that are a little disappointed in our assertions of power are going to want that power to be in that equation somewhere, because it's a little bit what Theodore Roosevelt said back in the turn of the last century. He said, look, if the British Empire is not going to rule the world, there's going to be a vacuum of power. If there's a vacuum of power, who shall fill that vacuum? Who would you like more than the United States? What other nation would you rather have filling that vacuum? But all these are geopolitical questions. You're quite right to say that the globalization of the world has altered our politics. But the question that we have to leave everybody with, not only in this program but in this series, is can we in any meaningful sense be a republic based upon the vision of the Founding Fathers in a world that is fundamentally different technologically, in which the lifespan of the American people has doubled in the last 150 years, in which missiles can cross the Atlantic Ocean in 30 minutes instead of the 6 months it would have taken Napoleon's army to come here, in which surveillance and the electronic revolution have changed the very notion of privacy. Is it possible for us to be a republic in the technological, demographic, and globalized world of the 21st century? I think the answer is we don't know. But if we were going to be a republic in that global environment, we would have to be Jefferson's people. We cannot be a television watching, game playing, self-deluding, indolent people if we want to be a republic in that world. We can be a lot of things in that world, but a republic means we have to get back on the saddle as citizens. And I think it's an open question about whether people in the long run prefer material prosperity or freedom. That question is going to be, I think, the question of the 21st century.